The boxes weren't heavy, but they pressed on me like a sentence already written. 2 cardboard lids bowed against family photographs. Walter's uniform. Letters my mother had saved in careful script. I carried them up the steps of the house on Hager Street. The same porch where I'd once watched my children trace chalk suns on the boards. Tatum met me at the door before I could knock. She didn't shout. She never needed to. Her voice cut in that measured, maybe practiced way. "You're not allowed in the house until you apologize." She didn't say for what. She didn't need to. We both knew it was about her dress, about a lie told twice until it sounded like truth. Behind the screen, Sawyer stood with his arms folded, his eyes dropped to the floorboards, following the grain like it was more urgent than my face. I waited for him to clear his throat, to gesture me inside, to say something that would make this a misunderstanding. Nothing came. I told him I had brought the boxes he asked for, the ones from the attic. He didn't move. Tatum's arms crossed tighter. A barricade. My throat tightened, but I bent down anyway, nudged the nearest box with the toe of my shoe. I stepped back, lifted them one by one, and carried them to the car. My knees ached, but my back stayed straight. 42 years of living in those rooms. And now I stood outside like a trespasser. I set the boxes in the trunk, closed it gently, and slid into the driver's seat. The hydrangeas bloomed blue against the fence. Walter's gift from decades ago. I turned the key, and as the engine caught, a thought came clear by nightfall. This house would no longer be theirs to bar me from. It began at the barbecue 2 weeks earlier, when the smoke from Sawyer's new gas grill drifted over the yard and neighbors gathered around paper plates. Tatum had chosen a pale silk dress, not the sort of thing you'd wear near open flame or children with ketchup bottles. Still, she made a show of brushing at the fabric halfway through the evening, turning to the group with a practiced frown. "She snagged it," she said, nodding toward me. Right before dinner, conversations faltered. I felt every head shift. I remembered bumping the cedar bench, the one Sawyer had installed only days before, its edges still rough. I said as much, even offered to pay for a repair. But Tatum waved me off with a smile that wasn't a smile. "It's fine," she told me, then repeated the story to anyone who would listen. By the time dessert came, her ruined dress had become the centerpiece of the night. That was how she worked nothing loud, never vulgar, just little revisions until the room accepted them as fact. My chair in their living room had vanished months ago, replaced by something from a catalog. When I asked about it, Tatum explained it didn't match the new layout. During dinners, when I spoke, her voice often slid in on top of mine, finishing a sentence I hadn't ended. The snagged dress became the excuse she needed. A small fiction polished into a public truth. Now it stood as a condition for my return. The proof that I was the problem. The reason Sawyer kept his eyes on the floor. I drove back from the porch with that memory ringing louder than their silence. And I knew I had to gather the papers that still carried my name. The house was still when I returned. The kind of silence that carried memory rather than peace. I set the boxes on the kitchen table, the same table Walter had sanded by hand when we first moved in. At exactly 4:10 p.m., the light fell through the western window, slicing across the surface in its usual line. I had timed it so often I no longer needed a clock. I lifted the lid from the first box. Walter's leather notebook lay on top, the one he used to scrawl to-do lists in a tight hand. Tighten laundry valve, replace porch rail, oil gate latch. Beneath those practical lines were smaller ones, half hidden in the margin plan anniversary weekend. Call florist. His handwriting looked as alive as the day he pressed the pen down. Next came baby photographs of Sawyer and Ellie, curls plastered to foreheads after baths, faces messy with frosting from birthdays I can still taste. I paused over each one. tracing their edges. In another envelope sat decades of Marion County tax receipts, each stamped paid with my name beneath the total. I spread them out like a deck of cards. Finally, at the bottom of the box, the deed, tenancy in common, executed after Walter's funeral when Sawyer insisted it would be easier. I hadn't argued then. I was too tired, too raw. But tucked into the file was the clause Walter had insisted on life use, reserved to Miriam Kincaid. My right to live, to occupy, to decide. I dialed the number of the bank and asked for Evan Cho. Patient, deliberate. He walked through the language. Your share is yours. Mrs. Da Kincaid. That clause gives you control. If you choose to sell, you can— His voice was steady, not surprised. He gave me the name of a lawyer on Court Street, Marshbell, someone who specialized in property transfers. After I hung up, I sat very still. The grief of Walter's absence pressed in, sudden as it had been the day he left the kitchen table mid-soup and never came back. Yet with the grief came clarity. The title was not a chain, it was a key. And if I chose to turn it, no one could bar me from that door again. The next morning, I gathered the file and walked downtown to Marsh's office. Marsh Bell's office overlooked Court Street, the blinds half drawn against the late summer glare. He read the deed with the care of a man who had seen too many families tear themselves apart over property. His glasses slid down his nose as he traced Walter's life use clause with a fingertip. Your son can argue about price, he said, his tone even. He can contest whether the valuation is fair, but the sale itself, that's yours to authorize. This clause secures it. The words landed like a verdict. I set the thick envelope of receipts on his desk, everyone showing my name and signature across 4 decades of taxes. He leafed through them slowly, nodded once, and placed them back in order. You've carried this house, he added quietly. The record makes that plain. I carried the papers home and laid them out on the dining table. The kitchen still smelled faintly of blueberry pie from the night before, but the sweetness no longer softened the bitterness. I dialed the number Ruth had given me weeks earlier, a broker she trusted. Harper Lowell, the voice answered, brisk but warm. I explained the situation in careful sentences, holding the phone steady with one hand and Walter's notebook in the other. She listened without interruption, then asked, Do you want visibility or do you want speed? I said, and no spectacle. We agreed on a private showing, discreet but thorough. Harper promised to bring an inspector she trusted, someone who knew the quirks of houses built in the early 80s. She would walk the rooms herself before listing. When I ended the call, I stood at the window. The hydrangeas bent in the breeze, their blue heavy against the fence. The plan was no longer an idea. It had weight, shape, momentum. By the end of the week, it would be moving without me. That evening, my phone buzzed twice. First with Sawyer's name, Don't make this bigger than it is. As if betrayal could be measured in size. As if a few inches of silence were smaller than 40 years of devotion. Minutes later, Tatum's message followed, clipped and tidy. We'll accept your apology tomorrow. I opened Marsh's letter, scanned the bolded clause that carried Walter's insistence, and pressed send. They would have their answer in legal form, not from my tongue. The kitchen grew dim, but I pulled flour from the pantry and butter from the fridge. My hands worked from memory, folding dough, sugaring berries. The pie was for no one but me, though when Ruth Delgado stopped by with tomatoes from her garden, I cut us both a slice. She tasted, then said softly, Things grow where they're tended. After she left, I pulled 2 boxes from the hall closet and set them on the table. On one, I wrote in black marker, Things that belong to me. On the other, Not coming with me. Walter's wristwatch went into the first. Steady as ever. A novelty apron from Tatum slid into the second without hesitation. By the time the oven cooled, The lines had been drawn. Tomorrow would bring strangers into the house. But tonight, the sorting had already begun. Harper arrived just after breakfast, punctual and brisk, with a man she introduced as Gabe Renteria. He carried a clipboard and moved through the house with an attentiveness that felt almost reverent. He tapped along the baseboards, checked outlets, leaned into the attic with a flashlight. "Strong bones," he said, scribbling notes. "Roof's solid. Minor caulking upstairs. Nothing serious. Whoever buys this place will have something worth keeping." I followed them from room to room, more witness than host, listening to Gabe's observations while Harper nodded. When we stepped back outside, she paused beneath the hydrangeas, their color still startling against the weathered fence. "I may already have the right buyers," she said. "Caleb and Nora Dunn. Originally from Oregon, just moved back from Arizona. They lost their only son 2 years ago and have been searching for a place that feels rooted, not staged. They want a house with history." Something in her tone told me she believed they were meant for this place. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. By late afternoon, while I was sorting another drawer of papers, Marcia's name appeared in my inbox. The subject line read simply, "Additional document." I opened the attachment and found a scanned letter, Walter's handwriting immediately familiar. It was a side agreement drafted during the original title changes, a clause I'd forgotten we even discussed. It granted me unilateral authority to sell under hardship or if continued co-ownership proved untenable. The words were plain, but the effect was profound. Sawyer's ability to obstruct had been cut off at the root years ago, though neither of us remembered it until now. Walter had thought ahead, protecting me in ways I hadn't recognized. I read the letter twice, my throat tightening. Not from grief, but from something steadier relief. I printed the document and placed it on top of the growing file. The evidence of a life measured in signatures and receipts. For the first time since the porch ultimatum, I felt the floor beneath me level out. Walter had left me one last safeguard. And it was enough. The next day, Harper would bring the Dunns for a private showing. Harper arrived just before noon with the Dunns in tow. Nora stepped into the kitchen first, her hand brushing over the pantry doors, fingers pausing on the mismatched knobs Walter had picked up at a garage sale. "These have character," she murmured, smiling at me as though I had done her a favor by leaving them there. Caleb moved more slowly, gravitating to the back windows. When he stepped outside, he lingered under the hydrangeas, touching the blossoms gently as if they were fragile relics. They walked the rooms without hurry, never once treating the house like inventory to be measured and replaced. In the living room, Nora asked where the armchair used to sit. She could sense a gap in the space. I told her about the hours I spent reading there, about Walter falling asleep with crossword puzzles balanced on his knees. She listened the way a daughter would, not a stranger. When the tour ended, Harper led us back to the kitchen. She set her clipboard on the table and spoke with a calm that carried no doubt. "They're prepared to make a full-price offer," she said. "Cash. No contingencies. Expedited escrow. They'd like to close before the end of the month." I didn't need to consider. The files were already stacked neatly beside me, Walter's side letter on top. I slid it aside to make room for the contract. Nora looked at me with quiet gratitude, as though my decision offered her not just a house, but a chance to begin again. I signed each page carefully, my pen steady, my name firm. By the time I set it down, the house was no longer mine in waiting. It was theirs in promise. An hour later, as Harper drove off with the paperwork, my phone lit up with Sawyer's name. "What are you doing?" "Stop this. We need to talk." The texts came in bursts, each more frantic than the last. I placed the phone face down on the table. Tatum's message followed. Long, clipped sentences, crafted like a corporate memo. This destabilizes the family structure. You're creating unnecessary confusion for Lila. We can't condone such reckless behavior. I read it once, then forwarded both messages and the executed documents to Marsh with a short note. Proceed as planned. The late afternoon light stretched across the floor, thin and golden, the same way it had when I carried boxes through this room for the first time. I stood by the window and watched shadows lengthen across the yard where Walter once built Sawyer a treehouse. The branches were bare now, the planks long gone, but the shape of what once stood remained. By sunset, the house was on its way to new hands, and for the first time in years, I felt the air inside loosen around me, making space for what came next. It was nearly dark when I saw his shadow on the porch. Sawyer knocked once, softly, the way he did as a boy when he'd come home late and didn't want Walter to hear. I opened the door before he could knock again. He looked smaller in the frame, shoulders hunched, tie loosened, eyes darting past me into the house like he wasn't sure if he was still welcome. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stepped aside. He sat at the kitchen table, the same chair Walter always claimed, and folded his hands as if waiting for a lecture. "Mom, this doesn't have to happen like this," he began. "The sale, it makes us all look bad. Just give it time. Let people forget about the incident. Then we can figure something out." I watched him struggle with the word apology, but he never said it. Instead, he leaned forward, voice dropping. "Maybe Mom didn't." His sentence dangled in the air, the defense I'd been waiting years to hear, but just as quickly. He pulled back. "Anyway, appearances matter. For Lila, for all of us." I stood, crossed to the drawer, and pulled out the folder I had prepared. I laid each page across the table, decades of property tax receipts, repair invoices in my name, bank statements showing every mortgage payment I had carried since Walter died. On top, I placed the boutique receipt for Tatum's dress, dated the day before that barbecue, with a notation in neat handwriting, repaired seam. No charge. Sawyer glanced at it, then away, his jaw tight. The truth lay between us, undeniable, but he refused to touch it. "You knew she twisted it," I said evenly. "And you let her. You stood on that porch and let her ban me from my own house." His face tightened. "It's complicated." "It isn't," I answered. "I won't apologize for keeping this house alive. I won't apologize for paying the bills, for preserving what your father and I built. Not to her, and not to you." He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping across the floor, but he didn't argue. He simply stood there, deflated, like a man who had come expecting to win something and left knowing he never could. The screen door banged behind him, and silence filled the kitchen again. I gathered the receipts into their folder and placed them back in the drawer. The papers were no longer weapons. They were simply records of a truth I no longer needed anyone else to name. The next morning, I woke before dawn with a steadiness that surprised me, and I began preparing for my meeting at the bank. At the bank, Evan greeted me with the same quiet politeness he had shown when he first explained the deed. We sat in a glass-walled office as I laid out the paperwork, and together we structured the trust. Every clause was deliberate funds protected. Long-term interest. No signatures required. But Lila's when the time came. I signed with a steady hand. The pen did not shake. That weekend, Lila drove up from Corvallis with a paper bag of warm scones she had bought along the way. She looked older than 19 in that moment, hair pulled back, eyes wary but kind. We sat at my kitchen table, the one that would soon belong to someone else, and I slid a small key across the surface. She picked it up, confused. "What's this?" "The safety deposit box." I told her. "Everything you'll need someday is inside. Not now, not yet. But when it's yours, you won't have to ask anyone's permission." Her lips parted, her voice hesitant. "Did you do all this for me?" I held her gaze. I did it for me, I said. And I included you, because you never made me small. She reached for my hand then, squeezing it with a seriousness that told me she understood more than she wanted to admit. The next day, Marsh forwarded me a copy of Tatum's final maneuver, an email she had sent to Sawyer's supervisor, hinting at family instability. Marsh's reply had been sharp and efficient. Cease all attempts to interfere with a valid transaction or face exposure. After that, the inbox went quiet. I closed my laptop, relieved by the silence. What mattered had already been secured, not in walls or deeds, but in the line of trust that now ran through my granddaughter's hands. The cottage on the coast was waiting. The call came mid-morning. Escrow had recorded. The wire confirmed. The sale complete. I folded the phone shut, stood at the window for a long moment, then gathered my bag. The house on Hager Street was no longer mine. Highway 22 carried me west through rolling farmland. Fields turning toward autumn, the air thick with cut hay. As the road climbed into the coast range, mist gathered along the pines. And by the time I descended toward Newport, the Yaquina Bay Bridge rose out of fog like a memory surfacing. The cottage I had rented sat a few blocks from the harbor. When I opened the door, the smell of cedar and salt met me first, clean and unclaimed. I set my bag down and let the silence settle. That evening, I took out paper and wrote 2 letters. The first was addressed to Sawyer, though I never planned to send it. You didn't do one unforgivable thing. You did 100 forgettable ones, and I will not carry them anymore. The second I sealed and addressed to Lila, we are not defined by rooms we shrink inside, but by the ones we refuse to. Remember that when the day comes, you must choose your own door. Later, in a plain spiral journal, I wrote 3 lines, steady and final. I am not a burden. I am not a backup plan. I am not sorry. I placed the pen aside, unlatched the window, and let the ocean air fill the room. The tide was moving in, and with it came the sound of waves against stone, patient and sure, carrying me into whatever waited beyond this new threshold.